Guys, can you hear me?
Yes, doctor, we can hear you.
Okay, you hear me, guys, right?
Yes, Dr. Harry.
Yes,
Okay, yeah. So this week we're going to address a different topic, which is regime change and democratization. So as I mentioned, these thematic topics, we are trying to pull together different streams from the existing literature in order to see what kind of theoretical questions these thematic topics actually raised and how the existing studies actually tackled and answered these and offered like plausible answers to these theoretical questions. So in the very beginning, if I ask you what democracy means, if you need to define a democratic regime, so what democratic regime is, what are the main features you need to see in this regime in order to dub it or to call it a democratic regime?
The freedom of press and freedom of movement, and everybody has his opinion to participate, and
So freedom of expression,
I guess
freedom,
representing all as social classes.
representation of different social groups.
Yes.
free,
Because
fair
class, like it
elections.
has like Marxist thrust, so social groups, it's like a broader
Okay.
category. Yeah.
Okay.
What else?
Freedom of media.
Yeah, like freedom of like media and press and freedom. It's part of like freedom of expression and circulation of or availability of the information and different sources of information.
I guess
Free
in
and
here
fair
I
elections.
agree. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Karma.
I was saying free and fair elections, but then Yara was saying something.
Yeah, like free and fair elections, or like free or equal um, like competition or political competition. So you covered almost like the components of or the procedural dimension of democracy. So at least we talk about like three main components. The first thing is like competitive elections and meaningful competition for all effective positions of the government. So you need like regularly to have like free and fair and transparent elections. All can compete, all like candidates and political parties can compete on equal footing in order to assume power or to occupy some power, some positions of power. Inclusive political participation. So you cannot exclude any social group on the basis of religion, gender, or ethnicity. So you cannot discriminate against out groups or different social groups on whatever basis. So you have to have like some legal and constitutional framework that would include, social groups and that they can participate inclusively in this kind of inclusive constitutional and legal framework. And you need to have like sufficient level of civil and political liberties like freedom of association, freedom of expression, um, uh, like uh, like freedom of the existence of diverse sources of information in order to guarantee the integrity of this meaningful political competition or electoral competition, and the integrity of this political participation or inclusivity of different social groups. So basically this kind of let me admit these people. Yeah. So we basically cover here the procedural or the minimal procedural dimension of democracy, which is like some sort of legal and constitutional. It has like some sort of legal and constitutional focus. So you have like different definitions, but more or less they covered, these three components. So Anthony Gaddens, for example, he mentioned like three main pillars of any democratic regime, like competitive and multi-party systems. So political parties can compete in free and fair elections, free and non-corrupt elections, like it has to be transparent and clean elections, effective legal framework that would safeguard these civil basic rights and civil and political rights for citizens. Robert Dahl actually mentioned like 8 institutional arrangements that more or less covered, you know, the 3 components and all the elements you actually talked about. So he talked about like different sort of like basic freedoms, like freedom to form your associations or organization, freedom of expression, and you have the right to cast not only the candidates to contest in electoral competition or electoral contestation, but everyone has the right to cast a ballot or to have a vote, and eligibility for public office, based on like the constitutional arrangements or constitutional guarantees. And then like fair competition and free and fair elections, and diverse multiple sources of information, like freedom of media and freedom of press, and responsive government, like if you citizens, they have like some sort of social and economic and political needs, so the government has to be responsive in a way or another to these public needs and public demands in a form of decision making or public policy making. But this is, it's debatable in the existing literature. We're still talking about, you know, this definition. So whether or not to focus on this procedural dimension, which is like elections and legal and constitutional guarantees, or we need to add like a substantive dimension, and we talk about the quality of this political democracy by adding different other elements that would cover like the material well-being of the citizens, like, or the human welfare. So we can talk about like social and economic equality. You cannot speak of like quality of democratic or political democratic regime with high level of social and economic inequality. Public deliberation, which is has something to do with this freedom of organization, but it's not like legally and constitutionally guaranteed, but effectively and realistically the regime or the democratic regime allows different social associations to deliberate publicly and freely without using any force or violence against them. The security and like the quality of security services and the availability of different people means for conflict resolution. So you have like this proceed, but this is the minimal definition with this like electoral contestation and the stipulation or the constitutional and legal guarantees of these basic rights. And then like the effective use or the implementation of these institutional arrangements, it would take this to a different level. So you have like 2 sources if you need like part of your research or doing research, you need to define well your concepts, and you need like valid measurement of these concepts. So you have here two sources in order to measure how democratic, you know, the regime is. So you have a Polity Project. This is the website. They have like different scores from authoritarian to democratic regimes, 10 minus 10, and they have like the code book in order to know how they actually measure the different components in order to call a regime authoritarian or democratic or semi-democratic. And then Freedom House, they used actually survey data in order to come up with their own score, in order to, and the score actually measured, you know, different forms of civil and political liberties. So you have like, for your research methodology class, if you need to conduct a research on democracy, this is like a broader topic, so you need to have like a valid measurement of the concept. So whether you focus on the functionality of the political regime and the institutional setting, or the effective practices of civil and political liberties. But we are here interested in, again, like the theoretical questions this theme may raise. So if I ask you guys how democratic regime will be established or installed, how are you gonna answer this question? in order to have like these legal and constitutional guarantees, in order to have like effective and realistic practices and sound practices of these civil and political rights. So what kind of factors would account for the establishment of democratic regime?
First of all, I can ask a question that if the ruling party is there because the majority choose this party or not?
Malak, right?
Yes.
Malak, I didn't get the question. This is a question or?
This is one of the theoretical questions I'm going to ask to make sure if this is a democratic. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So
if the ruling regime or party is there because the majority choose this party. Yani the majority supports
it's related
this party.
it's related to fair and free elections, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's again like how the ruling party assumed power.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, you focus on how fair and free the elections are. Right?
Yes, right.
Yeah. Okay. So Malak mentioned something about elections and public choice, or how like citizens and people voted for a political party, whether or not it actually represented them and reached power through fair and free elections. Okay. What else? What kind of
I guess يا دكتور in the degree of freedom إذا in general يعني هي the main factor for establishing a democratic regime.
Again, Yara?
Degree of freedom in general, a degree of freedom هي the main factor for establish any democratic regime.
Yeah, but how?
All aspects of the life.
How these freedoms actually got established to start with.
I didn't get your question يا دكتور يعني أنا مش فاهمة من
Okay,
يعني
yeah. So what kind I'm telling you what kind of theoretical questions actually the literature mentioned. So first of all, can we talk about some sort of a structural prerequisites for democracy? So do we need like high level of education, a specific level of economic development, some sort of civic culture in order to push for the establishment or the installation of these systems of or different systems of freedoms, and to allow for clean and free and fair elections? So the first question, are there any kind of structural prerequisites for democracy? So if these like structural conditions exist, so this is like much you can find or much more there exists like much more probability for the installation of democratic regimes. So how democratic regimes initially established or came into being? Okay, can we talk about like structural causes that led to eventually to the establishment of these democratic regimes? What kind of relationship between, in the literature, this question actually troubled many scholars. The relationship between economic performance and economic crisis and regime type or regime change. Whether or not economic crisis or different forms of economic crisis would lead to democratic breakdown. So if you have a democratic regime and economic crisis actually hit hard, so is there probability for regime collapse or democratic breakdown? Or if you have like low level or like sluggish economic system and stagnant economic growth, is there any probability or likelihood to establish democratic rule or democratic regime? So it's pretty much related to this structural causes of regime change or democratic transitions. So structural prerequisites for democracy or not? Is there any systematic relationship between economic conditions including economic crisis and regime change, or we can relegate, these kind of structural prerequisites or structural conditions to the margin, and we can talk about elite choices or agency choices. So it's again like a structural agency conundrum: structural preconditions or prerequisites, or agency choices. At the end of the day, it's kind of elite choices that would make this structural potential for democracy recognizable or realizable. Can we talk about are there any kind of similar mechanisms for the installation of a democratic regime and the endurance or the persistence of democratic regimes? So are there the same forces or the same causal forces and same mechanisms that led to the emergence of democratic regimes? Are there the same mechanisms would account for the persistence and the endurance and the consolidation of these democratic regimes? What are or what's the role of the cultural norms and values, whether there are like the cause or the effect of these democratic regimes? So the existence of civic education, tolerance, propensity to reconciliation in the society, or the values, the elites, the political elites actually endorse or embrace. Are there the cause for the establishment of democracy, or democracy by like rationalization, a system of practices and rationalization and over time would establish these cultural norms and cultural values? So we are going to tackle these questions. We are going to see how the existing studies and literature tackles and answers these questions. To start with these kind of structural prerequisites and these theoretical questions, existing some sort of researchers or some sort of studies actually answered these questions, but other studies found like kind of gaps in these answers. So that's why like structural prerequisites didn't answer the position of the economic conditions and whether or not it would enable regime change systematically over time, or is there any kind of causality that holds across time and space. And then these structural conditions didn't actually answer how the process actually unfolds. So that's why agency-based studies focused more on the strategic choices of elites. And then what's the role of the culture or the cultural values and norms? So that's why different studies actually tried to answer how culture would affect the emergence and the sustainability or the persistence of democratic regimes. So in this order, we are going to cover how the existing studies actually answered these questions. So the structural, for a long period of time, there was like a wide and strong belief in the existence or the necessity of some sort of structural prerequisites in order to install democratic governance or democratic regimes. So the modernization theory would actually argue for some specific like high level of social and economic conditions would enable and facilitate the installation of a democratic regime. So high level of per capita income, high level of urbanization, and high level of education or literacy level would actually enable democratic regime to emerge. And this is like the socioeconomic conditions that proponents of modernization theory would argue for, that you have to have like these kind of structural conditions or socioeconomic foundations in order to establish a democratic regime. Another variant, and we actually touched upon this, how capitalist developments, it's another mechanisms, not like socioeconomic conditions per se, but actually how the capitalist developments would trigger some sort of social and class transformations that would enable some social classes and social groups to emerge in order to pressure for or to to have like demands for democratic governance. So we actually tackled this when we talked about Moore, when he talked about how the modernization and commercialization of the agricultural system enabled cross-class alliance and led eventually to the bourgeoisie revolution. So the emergence of a bourgeoisie class that had like this strong impulse toward democratic governance, and they revolted in order to protect their economic interests, that led eventually to the establishment of parliamentary democracies. So different studies focused on different classes. Ruschemeyer, Huber, and Steffens, for example, focused on working class, how capitalist development enabled working class to organize themselves, to have effective means of communication and transportation, that pushed them to organize themselves and to push for to have like to pressure the dominant class in order to have some sort of representation in the power centers. Or Lebst, for example, talked about the emergence of educated middle class, and this middle class have like the middle class actually embraced, historically, this kind of democratic and liberal values and civic values that eventually pushed for or pressured the dominant class to establish democratic regimes. So within the same structural, this category of structural explanations of democracy, the capitalist developments not only didn't only lead to social transformations or the emergence of social pressures that created demands for democratic regime or democratic governance, but actually it led to some sort of social structural transformations or structural conditions that enabled democratic regime to emerge, or democratic demands to emerge. So with a high level of social equality, democracy like much more there's like high probability for a democratic regime to emerge, because like with high level of social equality, this is what literature actually says, but it's widely contested and disputed. So with high level of social equality, there will be like low level of social violence, and this would enable democratic regime to emerge and to persist. And relative distribution, again, this balance of power between different social groups, with the relative distribution of power among different social groups. So this would lead to more inclusive political participation, with no existence of particular social group would dominate or would monopolize the political the channels of political participation. In highly homogeneous societies, democratic regime much more likely to emerge. And again, like these kind of education and values, and this is related to cultural norms and values as well. With high level of development would lead to high level of education, and this would create basically educated class and middle class that would embrace and endorse civic and liberal values, and eventually would push for democratic or endorse these democratic values and democratic and push for democratic demands. So another variant in this literature focused on the characteristics of the political institutions. Some forms or some particular institutional configuration would allow for or guarantee stability and compromise. For example, like the party system, fragmented party system, logically, if you have like this kind of fragmented party system, this is like much more likely to have a unstable democratic governance or unstable political regime. So like cohesive or coherent party system would allow for would stabilize the entire political system, and would allow for this free and fair political competition to happen, and to be much more sustainable. electoral rules as well would allow for stability. Some particular rules would stabilize the entire system, while others would trigger fragmentation and social tension between different groups. For example, with the fragmentation of party system, you can go back to the last week's topic on de-alignment, how actually electoral volatility and fractionalized party system would allow for the alignment processes, and if this is not coincided with emergence of new parties to realign, partisan identification, or to create different partisan identification, this would destabilize the entire system. Electoral rules, like Nazi regime, for example, what allowed like proportional representation systems would allow for extremist parties to have some sort of representation in the existing system. So if you have like proportional, this is what the literature would say, like the allowing like extremist parties to have a say or to have a representation in the existing centers of powers would destabilize the entire system. And the only way to go around this, or to tackle this, or to resolve this problem, is to set like a minimum like electoral threshold in order to get admitted to the polity. So these kind of like small parties have to gain like have to actually to overcome or to gain at least like, for example, 5% of the national vote in order to get admitted to the existing political structure. So certain electoral rules would, as institutional rules, would stabilize or destabilize the existing system. And then they talked about if you have like different or heterogeneous society, but there are cross-cutting cleavages or overlapping membership, this would allow for a different form of reconciliation between different groups and mitigate, the effect of the polarization and the probable violent inclination between different groups. And some sort of constitutional agreements, like having like power sharing agreement or pact that would allow for a different form of group representations in the existing system, would enable this to happen. Lanes, for example, this is talked about the effect of the presidential and parliamentary systems as well on the stability or instability of the democratic regime or the existing political regimes. With the presidential system would allow for or trigger this zero-sum inclination. So presidential regimes are much more likely to be unstable or to be destabilized comparing to the parliamentary systems. Within these kind of structural explanations as well, they talked about the international structure and the international economic structure or the international economic conditions and political conditions. For example, the legacy of the colonial authority. One stream in the literature would say like British and former British colonies are much more likely to have democratic governance because they are in the pre-independence period, they were socialized into these inclusive and tolerance towards outgroups. So it's much more likely to transfer these practices after gaining their independence and establish or maintaining the same institutional rules. Economic dependency as well. So for example, O'Donnell mentioned something about economic like the Latin in some countries in Latin America, basically Brazil and Argentina, they were economically dependent on external forces, or they were economically dependent on the center. So that's why they had some sort of alliance between international, some sort of domestic forces, most especially the business groups and business associations or bourgeoisie. They had this kind of alliance with the military and then the international bourgeoisie or the international business groups, and they together led to the collapse of the democratic regimes in Latin America and the establishment of paving the way to the establishment of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes in Latin America with this trio, like the military, the domestic business associations, and the international business firms or business enterprises. And one of the structural factors that are related to the international conditions, political conditions, it's related to the diffusion and democracy promotion discourse. Like after the end of the Cold War, so one of the main pillar of the foreign policy of the United States, one of the main pillar actually focused on promoting democracy in the world. So this kind of changing of the international context and like having like some other countries or neighboring countries, they actually made their way to this democratic transition. They call it diffusion or demonstration effect. So with having, you know, this kind of democratic governance or democratic rule in your neighboring countries, this would have like a spillover into your own country in order to establish your own democratic regime or democratic governance. And that's actually happened with the third wave of democratization in the late 70s and throughout 90s in Latin America. So when like a country initiated, you know, the process with this changing of the international context, it led eventually to the establishment or the spread of democratic transitions across Latin America. So the focus on these kind of socioeconomic conditions, social structural conditions that are related to development or capitalist development and the emergence of social pressures or changing, tilting the balance of power between the state and society, that enabled some social classes or social groups to emerge and to have like to press and to push for their democratic claims, to have a say in the decision-making processes, or to have like representation in the centers of power. And one of the structural explanations as well, they would focus on this meso level of political institutions, meanwhiling, for example, how the fragmentation of party systems would stabilize or destabilize the entire political regime, and how electoral rules, proportional representation or majoritarian rule would encourage or facilitate compromise and stability, and whether or not particular electoral rules are inherently or these rules carry their endogenous problems that would destabilize the entire system. Ledgeport, for example, talked about constitutional arrangements in highly heterogeneous societies, how you can stabilize and mitigate any possible emergence of social violence by enabling this kind of reconciliation and having constitutional arrangements to share power. For example, in Lebanon, it's like highly heterogeneous societies. So they had this kind of agreement for representation of different sects in the political structure. So this kind of distribution of ministerial posts or like cabinet positions, and how like they have like their own share in the legislature or in the parliament according to their like ethnicity or sectarian belonging. Having this kind of power sharing tax between different social groups would encourage, you know, this would push for reconciliation and mitigate any dangerous consequences for polarization and and violent tension between different social groups. And Juan Lenz actually mentioned something about the dangerous consequences for presidential systems because these systems fed into this zero-sum mentality. The winners take all like inclinations, so that's why it's much more likely to be destabilized, and like the democratic regime is much more likely to break down. Another stream or another like trend focus on the international structure or the political and economic conditions at the international level. So they focus on this heritage institutional legacy of the colonial authority, or the position, this kind of country's position on the international economic structure, or demonstration effect and diffusion. But again, these kind of all these studies, they try to answer how democratic regimes actually were established, or and actually persisted or managed to persist over time. But one important question that would pop up to your mind, they actually didn't distinguish, or they didn't actually make any distinction between variables that would enable democratic government to, or democratic regime to come into being in the first place, and mechanisms that actually would sustain and would help these democratic regimes to stabilize over time. Because perhaps like we can speak of different mechanisms, different factors that would lead to the emergence of democratic regime in the first place, and they are different from different factors and different forces and mechanisms that would lead to its stability and its persistence and endurance over time. Another question, these kind of structural conditions or structural prerequisites may serve as facilitating factors or background conditions, but they actually do not explain the process. Why political elites, or why political elites would choose, these kind of institutional configuration or democratic regime to democratic rules to be installed. So it doesn't tell us, like the structural approach doesn't help us understand the strategic behavior of different political actors, what kind of choices they make, how they actually made or reached kind of a pact to exercise power, how they agreed on these institutional arrangements or institutional configurations. So agency choices are totally absent from these structural explanations. And another question, or another shortcoming or drawback in these explanations, they talked about different levels of development as prerequisite for democratic role or democratic transition or the installation of democratic regime. But we would single out this economic determinants that are widely disputed and largely contested by different scholars. So are there any kind of systematic relationships between economic crisis and economic conditions and regime change? Because in Latin America, in some countries, for example, democracy emerged in unfavorable circumstances, economic conditions, like when the economic crisis major cascaded, actually led all Latin American countries in the 80s, like foreign debt crisis, for example. It enabled transition, but before, economic crisis led to the regime breakdown in the 50s and 60s. So perhaps there is no the same economic factors that led to democratic breakdown in the 50s and 60s, the same factors exerted different or played different causal role in the transition processes. So are there any kind of time varying relationships between economic crisis and establishment or regime change or regime type? So we need to answer these questions. What's the role of the structural factors or the structural preconditions, and the effect of these structural preconditions on the establishment of a democratic regime, or on democratic transition, or on regime change, generally speaking, because it led to the democratic breakdown in the 50s and 60s, but the same economic conditions didn't actually preclude the emergence or democratic transitions in Latin America in the 50s and the 60s. So from these shortcomings in the structural explanations of democratic regimes or democratic governance, we will tackle, or we will single out this kind of the relationship between economic conditions and regime type, and then what's the role of agency choices in democratic transition. So for economic-based arguments, one of two main or widely known explanations about the role of economic crisis in democratic breakdown in Latin America, made by Guillermo O'Donnell and Juan Linz. So the first argument, I'll give you briefly the story, what happened in Latin America during that period. So populist regimes in Latin America in the 1920s and through 1950s, they tried to implement developmental policies called import substitution industrialization. So they need to establish their extensive industrial bases in their home countries in order to have homegrown developmental policies. And to have this development from within, to have their own industrial bases to produce, their finishing goods and consumer goods in order to substitute for the goods that they used to import. So they need some sort of technology and manpower in order to sustain this. So what Guillermo argued for, after the exhaustion of this easy phase of import substitution industrialization, like establishing factories and wide industrial bases in order to produce your goods or commodities and substitute for imported ones, you need to import, you need to intensify and to expand more. But ironically, you depended on other countries or external countries in order to import, some sort of equipment and technologies in order to sustain your industrialized economic system. And with these populist regimes implementing these import substitution industrialization, so they adopted these kind of far-reaching redistributive programs. It's pretty much similar to what Nasser did. They have extensive industrial bases, and they have they have to cultivate support, to build support base from popular classes, mainly labor forces. So they have to have to implement or to usher in these kind of far-reaching redistributive policies in order to guarantee labor rights, and to have to increase public spending on social welfare programs and social safety networks or social security policies. So you created popular classes that they had interest or increasing expectations and demands, that they kept putting or pressuring the existing regimes to maintain or to gain even more from the populist policies, or from these far-reaching redistributive policies. So what happened? Polarization between popular classes and business groups or business associations or right-wingers, generally speaking. They actually the regimes had to impose, for example, taxes in order to sustain or to perpetuate these kind of redistributive policies. So they totally disagreed on these redistributive measures that would compromise their economic interest. So popular classes, basically labor movements and labor-based parties, they asked for more social spending and more more social benefits or material benefits from the existing regime that already got exhausted. And then business groups and business associations, and they tried to protect their properties and property rights that actually disagreed on these redistributive policies. So with this kind of polarization between different social groups, the existing regime was unable to spend more on social spending or on these redistributive programs, and the regime was not able as well to compromise or to touch, the property rights, or to threaten, the property rights of the business groups or upper classes. So the upper classes resorted to the military in order to remove the populist regimes from power and to put an end to this social polarization. So what Guillermo O'Donnell mentioned here, this kind of social polarization between different social classes or different social groups made democracy incompatible with this kind of structural development processes of import, substitution, industrialization. These social polarization made democracy kind of incompatible with democratic governance. So the political regimes, the right-wingers or the business associations resorted to the army. So they had like a coalition, or they built an alliance with the military in order to remove or to overthrow populist regimes from power. And in another, from a different angle, this kind of dependency on technology and industrial equipment from abroad, this created like a structural economic dependency of these countries that created, some sort of tripartite alliance between domestic bourgeoisie and international bourgeoisie that eventually paved the way or gave way to military authoritarian regimes to overthrow populist ones and to install new authoritarian regimes. Juan Lenz tackled this from different perspectives. He mentioned something about these kind of unresolvable crises, these kind of economic crises, in conjunction with some institutional factors like the existence of presidential regimes, fragmented party systems, or ideologically polarized party system between the right and the left, made these economic crises unresolvable, and ultimately, this ultimately led to the eroding the legitimate basis of the existing regime, and eventually led to its entire collapse. These kind of structural arguments and economic-based arguments were largely contested in other studies, but different scholarly works, they kept replicating or they kept reproducing the same argument about the effect or the impact of economic crisis on democratic endurance or on regime change, generally speaking, like enabling or unenabling democratic regime to emerge. As I mentioned, like Karen Rammer, for example, this is like one of the Huntington and Rammer actually contested, this economic-based. Just bear with me, guys. دكتور معلش عندي محاضرة وبستخدم الإنترنت دمك، ماشي؟ ماشي حبيبتي، ماشي، مع السلامة. Guys, can you hear me?
Yes, doctor.
Yes, doctor.
Yeah, because it got disconnected because I'm using the hotspot from the phone. Okay, so you heard everything, right?
Yes, doctor.
Or it was okay. It didn't get disconnected.
We stopped at Rammer.
No.
Yeah, okay.
The last thing we stopped in.
Okay. So the same economic conditions, like debt crisis, for example, in Latin America, it enabled regime transition. While it led to democratic breakdown in the 50s and 60s, it actually facilitated transition. So perhaps these kind of structural economic conditions function, like operated as a background condition or interacted with other factors in order to produce certain political outcomes, or regime change, whether like democratic breakdown or democratic transition. So we need to examine the operation or the causal force of these economics on political outcomes. So here in your assigned readings, Gasiorowski like used pooled time series cross-sectional analysis, again statistical analysis or statistical measures, in order to examine the effect of these structural economic conditions. So I'll mention like the main findings, and let me go one by one. Like, for example, he found that economic crises had like a significant correlation or significant relation, mainly like inflation and slow economic growth. They had like significant relation or correlation with democratic breakdown from the 1950s until the mid 70s. So here you have, like this inflation rate, and you have like the first two columns of the results here, democratic breakdown, and then democratic breakdown, and here democratic transition. So let's see how like a slow economic growth or inflation rate exerted different or had like different relationship with democratic breakdown and democratic transition. So here you have like the inflation rate. It's statistically, you see the asterisk here, 0.917. It's statistically significant, and it led to a democratic breakdown. But the same variable, it had like the asterisk, it signifies, different asterisks actually signify the statistically significant or insignificant. Here, the inflation doesn't have any kind of statistical significance or no support whatsoever that inflation rates had any kind of causal impact or correlation with democratic transition. With a slow economic growth, actually, they had like negatively related to democratic breakdown, and statistically significant with this with democratic breakdown in the 50s until mid 70s, but actually they had like no kind of the same variable has no kind of significant relationship with democratic transition. So he mentioned something about this positive correlation between economic crisis and slow economic growth, slow economic growth and democratic breakdown in countries, in different countries over this long period of time, from 50s and until mid 70s. In order to test here, here like there is a variable related to the year. So you see here, like it's negatively correlated with the regime breakdown, but it's not significant at all with democratic transition. And in order to test, this interaction effect between inflation rates and its effect over time, he used, this interaction term between inflation and year, and it's negatively related to democratic regimes in the 50s until mid 70s that led to democratic breakdown. Here, negative 0.0992, statistically significant, but here it had like in the opposite direction. It had the effect, but in the opposite direction. The same like economic crisis measured by inflation rate, it had like positive correlation or positive relation with it, enabled actually democratic transition in the 80s. So he actually mentioned something about time varying effect of economic crisis in the 80s. So the inflation rate seemed to facilitate democratic transition in the 80s, and it goes in line. It aligned with some factual data in Latin America or some countries of the third wave of democratization. And again, these kind of socio-structural factors, or that is related to the development level measured by the per capita income, the correlation, it has like positive correlation with transition. So it might exert some causal, it has like a causal power, but in one direction, but not in the other. So here you have income per capita, no significant relationship with democratic breakdown, but it actually here like 2 asterisks here with the democratic transition. So the same socio-structural factor had no kind of statistical relationship with democratic breakdown in the 50s and throughout the mid 70s, but actually it enabled democratic transition in the 80s. So like they had like the literature, or these studies, the existing literature raised some other theoretical questions, and from the existing gaps and shortcomings in the existing structural explanations, other scholars and other scholarly works they're on these subjects with using some statistical tools in order to answer to what extent economic crisis would affect, or causally, if there is any causal effect between economic crisis and regime type or regime change, breakdown or democratic transitions. One, like, can you guys, if you see the table, can you highlight or pinpoint other interesting results? So we actually focus on statistically significant variables with the asterisks. And you have here like 1 asterisk, meaning you will learn more about this, but it's different, you know, like p-values, like and confidence levels, 90 and 99 and 95%. 3 asterisks, it's like 99%. So this is like the confidence level, and then 55 2 asterisks, and then 90% 1 asterisk. So the probability of being wrong is really low. Are there variables that are like interesting and we need to highlight in our results or reporting, you know, these results or these statistical findings?
Can the log regime duration be interesting or not?
We don't have, if you read it well, so here you see the arrow. There is no asterisk at all. So perhaps like regime duration doesn't have any like significant relationship with the regime type or regime change, breakdown or transitions, democratic breakdowns or regime transitions. So we are reporting like statistically significant variables.
Mel regime?
Sorry? Yeah, military regimes. Yeah, very good. So these kind of military regimes, they are like statistically significant when it comes to democratic transition, which is like really interesting results, like perhaps like one form of particular authoritarian regimes or authoritarian type is prone to democratic transition, than more prone than others when it comes to democratic transitions. So what else?
Regrowth? Log regrowth after log inflation?
We reported this already. Like it affected like democratic breakdown, but it had like no significant, or there is no like support whatsoever its effect on relationship or correlation with the democratic transition.
Regime
Regiondom, like it measures. Yeah, sorry, I had to mention something about what these variables actually, the abbreviation actually stands for. This is, it measures actually diffusion, like the demonstration effect. Like if there is kind of a spread of like the Arab uprisings, for example, it started in Tunisia, and then like the diffusion of social protests that lead to different political outcomes and different political trajectories. Like same diffusion mechanisms would lead to the spread of democratic regimes. So here, like when it comes to democratic transitions, this is another like factor that might, you know, interact with debt crisis or economic crisis, or mitigated, you know, the effect of the economic crisis and enabled regime transition, as Remer actually argued for or maintained. So here, like the military and regional or the demonstration effect. And what's striking, like when you have like a strong or well-established trend in the existing literature that would say, like, you know what, the specific institutional configurations like presidential system would impede or preclude democratic transition or destabilize the regimes. So perhaps like insignificant relationship, it would be like important or crucial to report as well. So here, guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yeah, doctor.
Yeah, because the internet is unstable. So here, so you have the presidential. You see the presidential here. It had like no causal or no correlation, statistically significant correlation with the regime breakdown. Like you have well-established like a trend in the literature actually introduced by Juan Lenz, mentioned something about legitimacy, like in relation to different, like these economic crises, in relation to different institutional or in conjunction with different institutional configurations, it led to democratic breakdowns in Latin American countries. So other variables that would be interesting to report or to juxtapose while reporting or while analyzing the effect of the economic crisis on regime type or regime change. So the demonstration effect, it has like positive relationship. Presidentialism as institutional rule or institutional arrangement, it has no statistically significant relationship with regime breakdown or democratic breakdown. And what's striking is this kind of the military regime and its positive correlation or positive relationship with democratic transition that would raise, you know, some other theoretical question about whether or not different authoritarian forms or different authoritarian types are actually inclined more to democratic transitions than others. And this is what actually Barbara gets actually argued for or tackled in some details. But again, these kind of structural prerequisites and highlighting importance of other factors do not tell us more about electoral choices or the strategic behavior or elite choices in order to establish or to install these democratic institutional configurations or arrangements. So when it comes to different forms of authoritarian regimes and why like military regimes are more prone to democratic transitions than others, Barbara Getz mentioned something about elite fractions and how these elite fractions are consequential for some choices made that enabled democratic transitions. So she highlighted, you know, this different for like made, you know, this classification between different regime types. I'm getting to this shortly, and how elite divisions affected or had like different different consequences for democratic transitions or democratic changes. And again, why political elites actually how they realized these structural potential, like the existence of economic crisis or the demonstration effects or these kind of elite fractions, how political elites strategically behaved in order to realize these structural potential for democracy, and to establish or to make these democratic transitions by establishing different rules of the game. So starting with Barbara Getz here, she again studied like 163 regime transitions between 1945 and 1995. And she made this classification between different authoritarian regimes. She made a distinction between military regimes and one party or one single party rule or party regime and personalist regimes. And the functionality and how elite fractions and these kind of divisions and differences and disputes over policy choices and over how to tackle or to handle elite fractions and elite rivals operated differently in different types of authoritarian regimes. So try to guess, guys, why military regimes are much more likely to make, you know, this democratic transitions when it comes to when like elite fractions started to surface.
I think, as we said in the beginning, that this elite, this elite will, I don't know how to say it, but the idea is that the bourgeoisie or a specific type of people are going to have some benefits with the military group, with the military regime. So there will be no democracy in the country. You got my idea, or it's not clear?
Okay, so let me make it like much more approachable. So like the military regimes got established or installed in Latin America in the 50s and 60s, okay? And then some sort of elite rivals and competitions happened from within and pushed the military regimes to enable or to facilitate these, to hand over power to civilians and to facilitate these democratic transitions. So why the military regimes or the military elite, the generals, made this choice to withdraw to the barracks and to hand over power to civilians?
To prevent civil war?
Sorry, Salma?
Maybe to prevent a civil war.
Yeah, but this is like the ultimate, you know, coercive apparatus in the state. They actually resorted to this in the very beginning to the business, the upper classes or the right wingers, in order to restore stability and order. So what happened? It kind of division from within. So different kind of causal forces or different causal mechanisms that actually would account for how elite divisions within like military authoritarian regimes would push for democratic transitions, while perhaps like the same potential of elite competitions or elite divisions in other authoritarian regimes like one-party systems or personalist regimes are less likely to emerge in the first place, or if it emerged, it it operated differently in these regimes. So what gets actually mentioned, she mentioned something about when these kind of elite factions and elite divisions started to surface in military regimes, it might be much more threatening because like the generals or different factions inside the military establishment, whether they are pro or against, the withdrawal or the transfer or the handing over power. So the most important strategy or the most important goal for them is to maintain the coherence or the cohesiveness of the military as an institution. So they don't want to these kind of elite rivals or elite divisions to erode this cohesiveness or the coherence or the of the military as an institution. So they had like the first priority is to act as a whole, as an institute, as like despite the differences between them, like to intervene or to maintain or to sustain their political position or power, or to hand over power, or to withdraw or to transfer the power to the political power to the civilians. Both factions, they have like interest in maintaining the coherence and the cohesiveness of the military as an institution. So that's why withdrawing or returning to the barracks would be like the most attractive option for them when it comes to this emerging differences or disputes over policy choices or like economic or political choices. So that's why as she argued, like military regimes based on some empirical facts, they are much more likely to hand over power and to make this kind of democratic transitions. While in one party system or one single party rule and personalist regimes, with the one party or one single party system, what happens when it comes to elite divisions or elite fractions that would emerge between party leaders and different members or elite circles, with the one party system, different factions, they have like vested interest. This is the only political avenue available for them in order to advance their political career. So the rational or the most attractive option for them is to bandwagon, with the winning faction. So it's much more likely to maintain or like elite fractions or elite divisions, less likely to bring about, democratic transitions in these one single party, because like different circles that benefited from the existing party rule and even like electoral constituencies, they had like vested interest. In Mexico, for example, when like the PRD defected or broke away with the dominant party, it didn't eventually lead to the collapse, or it didn't introduce democratic transitions in Mexico right after the Revolutionary Democratic Party is split from the dominant party, because like still like electoral constituents or different citizens, they have vested interest in voting for the existing party in order to benefit from this kind of material clientelistic machine and the distribution of material benefits on the one hand, and on the other, some other political elites, they had vested interest in maintaining their membership or fostering their relationship with the existing party because they need to advance their political career. With personalist regimes, like all the rules actually centered on this patrimonial structure and narrow elite circles that benefit from the existing or embedded into this patronage network, and they benefited from their close relationship with the personal leaders. So they don't have like a broad support base in society, and they had like vested interest in maintaining this narrow clientelistic and patronage network in order to maintain their benefits. So the model tendencies when it comes to the regime breakdown in these types of authoritarianism, this would happen with like external exogenous shock, like economic international pressures, or international intervention, or popular uprisings or mobilizations, or as like Sandinistas against Somoza, for example, like this kind of insurgency that sustained its violent and armed conflict against the family or the Somoza dynasty in order to topple them eventually. So like there is kind of plausible or reasonable explanation why military regimes would actually, but she didn't actually answer the unravel the mechanisms or uncover the mechanisms by which generals would make this choice by transferring or handing over power to civilians. But again, she focused on this kind of elite divisions or elite factions that made like democratic transitions or handing over power at the most attractive option for the military junta or the military leaders. But again, like how like political elites would make, you know, this kind of choice in order to facilitate democratic transitions. For example, why and how business associations or like the right-wing parties that previously enabled the military regime to intervene and actually called upon the military generals to intervene in order to restore stability and order, how political elites or like the leaders of these political parties made choice to enable or to facilitate democratic transition and to realize these kind of structural potential for democratic transitions in Latin America, for example. And here another stream in the literature focuses on strategic choices and strategic behavior and elite choices. Basically, Guillermo O'Donnell and Philip Schmitter, this is one of the assigned readings, they focused on elite behaviors and how they actually made kind of pacts with some coalitional or non-coalitional elements. They managed to get together in order to reach a compromise and enable the installation of or a return of democracy in Latin America, or the installation of new democratic governance. So the basic or the foundation here is democracy or democratic regime actually emanates from this prolonged and inconclusive political struggles between different elite factions. So different political elites, right-wingers and left-wingers, popular mobilization from below, enabled social and political oppositions to pressure the military regimes or the existing dominant ruling class to liberalize and to open up political space for them. So the initial moment is this kind of struggle, mobilization from below, or fractions and divisions from above that actually enabled political elites to take or to implement some political liberalization measures and to enable or to facilitate democratic transitions eventually. So according to this like trend in the literature, they focus on elite divisions, the divisions between softliners and hardliners. Softliners that they needed to introduce some political reform measures and liberalization measures in order to appease or to alleviate social anger and social pressures. And then from the opposition side, mobilization from below or other political oppositional forces, they were divided between extremist and moderates, moderate opposition and extremist oppositional forces. So what happened, like the soft liners from the existing ruling elites or ruling groups, they managed to make a pact or to have a deal with the moderate opposition. So they negotiated and they reached a deal and agreement on specific rules of exercising power. So they had like this kind of compromise and agreement between them. For example, how to focus on, to converge on particular issues in order to preserve the vital interest of the parties that are entering actually this kind of political deal or political pact. For example, moderates, they have to exclude extremists from their camp, and softliners, they have to defect from the hardliners in order to offer some, in order to compromise and to offer some political concessions to the opposition. And perhaps some indivisible or insoluble political and economic issues, they will take this off from the negotiation table. They would limit, the policy space or the policy agenda to the issues that they can compromise or they can have an agreement on this. So they might like exclude extremists and exclude this kind of, in Latin America, basically left and right polarization. They focus on like redistribution measures, how to protect property rights for business associations and upper classes and right wingers and the political parties that represent the upper classes and the right wingers. So how they exclude these kind of redistributive and far-reaching redistributive measures or populist measures that previously were implemented and led to heightened the political polarization and led to the installation of the military regimes. So from the long and inconclusive struggles, elite divisions and rising social oppositions or social mobilization would bring softliners from this camp and moderates from that camp in order to get to the negotiation table and to reach an agreement about exercising of power and make this electoral transitions and to enable these transitions. So this actually agency based explanations, the explanations actually brought together both like strategic interactions between different elite groups and mass mobilization as well, because like the emergence of these mass mobilizations and these oppositions from different social groups, this actually like capitalized on existing elite divisions or created these elite divisions. But in like whatever the case, it pushed these kind of social mobilizations and elite divisions, they together in a general in a common framework, they pushed all actors to the bargaining table in order to reach an agreement or to have a democratic deal, and this would increase the bargaining leverage of political opposition anyway. And how to reach this pact or to make this kind of to enable these kind of democratic transitions, Macfall focused on the balance of power between political oppositions and elite circles as well. So when there is kind of decisive, when the balance of power actually is highly skewed, or it actually in favor of the opposition, so they don't need to any kind of negotiation at all between the social oppositions. They don't need any kind of negotiation with the incumbents, and they had some sort of leverage in order to impose their own terms at the negotiation table. So they have like high bargaining leverage if they have like if the balance of power is in favor of political opposition, and that happened in Czechoslovakia before the collapse of the entire state, and Hungary and Poland. Or this balance of power between rising social oppositions and incumbents are uncertain, or even it actually enabled some sort of democratic deal as well, like what happened in Bulgaria. He focused focused mainly on East Europe or former Soviet states. And then when there is kind of, this is why we can integrate mass mobilizations into the same model of elite strategic interactions. When the balance of power actually is in favor of or inclined, towards incumbent power, this would prevent, would suppress social mobilizations and would preclude, any kind of democratic, any kind of negotiation between social oppositions and communist or incumbent elites, as it happened in Romania. So when it comes to elite strategic interactions or elite strategic choices, so one trend focuses on like this pact making between social oppositions and moderate and soft liners, and other stream focuses on the balance of power between rising opposition and incumbent elites or dominant ruling elites, and both actually focused on the bargaining leverage of the political opposition and what kind of terms they would what kind of democratic deal or democratic agreement they would actually decide on. So as I mentioned, in order to get to the negotiation table or to have this kind of democratic deal with old regime incumbents or authoritarian regimes, they have to converge on issues like distribution of some ministerial and cabinet posts or economic and budgetary shares in order to enable all parties from the opposition and the regime incumbents, all old guards or old figures, in order to have a stake in the existing or the emerging, the newly emerging democratic regimes, and you have to exclude, these kind of contested issues. This is the trend that focuses on elite strategic choices and the negotiation between old regime incumbents and social oppositions. But actually, as Schmitter and O'Donnell mentioned, this is actually didn't cover all forms of democratic transition of the third wave and fourth wave, as Maxwell mentioned. But again, they focus on the balance of power between social oppositions, old regime incumbents or elite fractions, in order to enable, this democratic deal, or to enable social oppositions that they have decisive power relationship with the old regime incumbents to enforce their democratic terms and to oblige old regime incumbents to withdraw. With these kind of agency-based, guys, how much time left?
Time is ended, doctor.
Oh, okay.
We took more 10 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay. So we will continue, we'll finish, this negotiated and pact making exercise when it comes to democratic transition within this framework of agency-centric or agency-based explanations next time, and then the cultural, the position of the cultural explanation. And you have we mentioned something about James Mahoney before, this historical institutionalism, and how historical institutionalism that is barely applied to some themes in comparative politics, how it would explain the endurance or the past dependent democratic regimes in Costa Rica. So we'll cover this next time. So for now, do you have any question? So I'll summarize and wrap up again next lecture. But for now, any sort of queries or questions so far with regard to cultural structural explanations and the main drawbacks or shortcomings, and the position or the operation, the causal force of economic crisis as one of the structural element on regime transition, and then agency choices and strategic behavior of political elites, and how we can integrate mass mobilizations into the same model.
No, thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, okay. So we covered mainly like the structural prerequisites for democracy and what are the main shortcomings. And from these shortcomings, we tackled like two issues regarding the systematic relationships between economic conditions and the role of agency choices. Okay, with the agency choices, we covered like elite fractions and different mechanisms that would enable and pave the way for regime transitions or democratic transitions, mainly Geddes with the focus on military authoritarian regimes, and O'Donnell with the pact making, Macfall with this balance of forces between social oppositions, social political oppositions, and all the regime incumbents, and how this would affect elite strategic behavior and would facilitate or preclude the reach of the democratic deal. Okay. So we'll continue on this, the role of agency choices next time. And then we will cover like the two last questions about the cultural explanation and whether or not we can distinguish between the mechanism that would enable democratic regimes to install in the first place and the different mechanisms that we have to analytically distinguish between the forces that would pave the way for democratic regimes to be established and installed, and different other mechanisms that would enable democratic regimes to endure or to persist. And then we will cover the role of cultural norms and values, whether or not we can consider culture as a cause or effect of democratic rule or democratic regime. Okay?
Okay, Doctor, thank you.
Yeah, okay, guys. So see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.